It was the 6th of January, 1943. The air above Stalingrad hung thick with smoke and the bitter cold of a Russian winter that had already claimed more lives than bullets ever could. In the skeletal remains of what had once been a textile factory on the eastern bank of the Volga River, a German soldier crouched behind a shattered window frame, his breath forming clouds of vapor that dissolved into the frozen darkness. His hands, wrapped in torn strips of cloth salvaged from the dead, trembled as they gripped a Karabiner 98 rifle. The weapon was old, the wood stock cracked from repeated impacts, but it still fired true. That was all that mattered. That and the 23 rounds remaining in his ammunition pouch. His name does not appear in the official records. The Soviet archives list him only as a defector from the German 6th Army, interrogated on the 9th of January and subsequently employed as a tactical guide through the urban ruins his former comrades still occupied. But in those final days of the siege, names had ceased to matter. Identity had been reduced to a simple question of affiliation: German or Soviet, hunter or hunted, alive or waiting to be dead. Welcome to Untold Dawn, where we uncover the hidden stories history tried to forget. The factory floor beneath him was a graveyard of machinery and men. Twisted metal beams jutted from piles of rubble like the ribs of some enormous beast. Bodies lay where they had fallen, frozen into positions of final agony, their uniforms stiff with ice and dried blood. Some wore the field grey of the Wehrmacht. Others wore the brown of the Red Army. In death, they looked identical, hollow-eyed, emaciated. Young men who had aged decades in a matter of months. He had been in Stalingrad since September. 4 months that felt like 4 years. His unit, part of the 6th Army's 71st Infantry Division, had entered the city with the confidence of men who believed victory was a matter of days. They had been told the Soviets were broken, that one final push would collapse the entire Eastern Front. They had been told many things, all of them lies. By November, the 6th Army had been surrounded. The Soviet offensive, launched on the 19th of that month, had cut through the Romanian and Italian forces, protecting the German flanks, and closed like a steel trap around General Friedrich Paulus and 300,000 men. The Luftwaffe had promised to supply the encircled army by air. They delivered a fraction of what was needed. Men began to starve. Horses were slaughtered and devoured. Then the horses ran out. The soldier shifted his position, careful not to disturb the loose bricks that formed his makeshift parapet. Across the street, perhaps 80 meters distant, another ruined building mirrored his own. Soviet snipers had been active in that sector for 3 days. He had seen the muzzle flashes at dawn, heard the crack of bullets striking stone. 2 men from his company had died trying to cross the open ground between the factory and what remained of a municipal hospital. Their bodies still lay in the snow, unclaimed and unmourned. He had stopped mourning in December. The cold was absolute. It penetrated every layer of clothing, every attempt at insulation. His boots, once sturdy leather, had developed cracks that let in moisture and ice. His toes had gone numb 2 weeks ago. He no longer checked to see if they were still there. Frostbite was inevitable. Amputation, if he survived long enough to receive it, was the best he could hope for. Most men simply died. Their extremities blackened and rotted while they still breathed, and infection or cold or a Soviet bullet finished what the winter had begun. Hunger was worse than cold. The official ration had been reduced 3 times since the encirclement. Now it consisted of 100 grams of bread per day, supplemented by whatever could be scavenged from the ruins. Rats, when they could be caught. Leather belts, boiled until they softened enough to chew. There were rumors, whispered in the dark corners of basements and bunkers, of other things. Things no one spoke of directly. He had seen men with the hollow stare of those who had crossed a line they could never uncross. He had not crossed it, not yet. A sound reached him through the stillness, the crunch of boots on snow. He pressed himself flat against the floor, his rifle tight against his shoulder, his eye finding the iron sights by instinct. The sound came again, closer. Someone was moving through the rubble below, in what had once been the factory's ground floor. Friend or enemy? The distinction mattered, but less than it once had. The footsteps stopped. A voice called out in German, hoarse and cracked from disuse. It belonged to Corporal Werner Hals, one of the 6 men remaining from a platoon that had numbered 40 in September. Hals was 31 years old, a baker from Hamburg who had been drafted in 1940. He had a wife and 2 daughters he would never see again. Everyone knew it. Hals knew it most of all. The soldier did not answer. He waited, watching the darkness below, listening for any sound that might indicate a Soviet infiltrator using Hals as bait. It had happened before. The Red Army had men who spoke perfect German, who knew the names and ranks and backgrounds of captured soldiers, and used that knowledge to sow confusion and death. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. Hals appeared at the base of the stairwell, a skeletal figure wrapped in a tattered greatcoat that hung from his frame like a burial shroud. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He carried no weapon. That alone marked him as a man who had given up. "They are pulling back," Hals said. His voice echoed in the empty space, the entire sector. "Orders came an hour ago. We are to withdraw to the railway station and consolidate the perimeter." The soldier said nothing. Consolidate the perimeter. The phrase was meaningless. There was no perimeter left to consolidate. The 6th Army held a shrinking pocket of ruins, surrounded on all sides, with no hope of relief and no possibility of escape. General Paulus had been forbidden to surrender by direct order of Adolf Hitler himself. They were to fight to the last man, for the glory of the Reich, for a future that had already abandoned them. "Are you coming?" Hals asked. It was not really a question. They both knew the answer. There was nowhere to go. The railway station was no safer than the factory. Everywhere was the same, rubble and death and cold. The soldier looked out through the window at the city beyond. Stalingrad had once been home to 500,000 people. Now it was a necropolis, a maze of broken walls and shattered streets where every shadow concealed either death or the men who delivered it. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, black columns that merged with the overcast sky until it was impossible to tell where the city ended and the heavens began. He thought of home, of Bavaria, green and sunlit, with mountains that touched the clouds and valleys that smelled of pine and wildflowers. He thought of his mother, who had waved goodbye from the doorstep of their farmhouse in the summer of 1941, her face bright with pride and fear. He thought of his younger brother, who had wanted to enlist, but had been turned away for poor eyesight. Lucky boy. Lucky, lucky boy. Hals waited. The soldier could hear his labored breathing, the wet rattle of lungs damaged by cold and smoke, and the early stages of pneumonia. Hals would be dead within a week, maybe less. It did not matter if he went to the railway station or stayed in the factory. The outcome was identical. "I will stay," the soldier said. Hals nodded. He had expected nothing else. He turned and disappeared back into the darkness, his footsteps fading until only silence remained. The soldier was alone again. Alone with the dead and the cold and the knowledge that he would soon join them. But something had changed. Some small thing, barely perceptible like the first crack in a frozen lake. He could not name it, could not articulate what it was or why it mattered. But it was there, growing in the back of his mind, a whisper that would not be silenced. He had been a loyal soldier of the Reich. He had believed in duty, in honor, in the righteousness of the cause for which he fought. But belief required hope, and hope had died in the cold and hunger of Stalingrad. What remained was only the animal instinct to survive, and that instinct was beginning to ask questions that had no good answers. Night fell. The darkness was total, broken only by the distant flicker of fires and the occasional burst of tracer rounds arcing across the sky. The soldier remained at his post, watching, waiting, thinking. Below him, the city breathed with the sounds of war. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Small arms fire crackled and popped like breaking ice. Men screamed. Men died. The cycle repeated, endless and inevitable. At some point, he must have slept, because when he opened his eyes again, the sky had lightened to the bruised gray of dawn. His body was stiff, every joint locked with cold. His fingers had gone white, bloodless. He flexed them slowly, painfully, willing circulation back into the tissue. The rifle lay across his lap, covered in a thin layer of frost. movement caught his eye. Across the street, in the building he had been watching for 3 days, a figure appeared at a window. Soviet. He could tell by the silhouette, by the shape of the helmet and the cut of the uniform. A sniper like himself, taking up position for the day's work. He raised his rifle. The figure did the same. They stared at each other across the frozen wasteland that separated them, two men who were reflections of the same nightmare. German and Soviet, enemy and enemy, both trapped in a city that had become a mouth that devoured everything fed into it. The soldier's finger rested on the trigger. One squeeze, one bullet, one more death in a place where death had become mundane. But he did not fire. The Soviet did not fire. They simply watched each other, waiting for something neither could name. Minutes passed. The light grew stronger. The city around them began to wake, if waking was the word for what happened in Stalingrad each morning. The resurrection of violence, the renewal of killing, the daily ritual of men trying to murder each other over ground that had already been reduced to worthlessness. The Soviet lowered his rifle first. He stepped back from the window, out of sight. The soldier lowered his own weapon, confused and unsettled by what had just occurred. It felt like a violation of some unspoken rule, a breach of the natural order. They should have tried to kill each other. That was what soldiers did. That was the entire purpose of their existence in this place. But neither had fired. The soldier sat back against the wall, his mind churning. Something was wrong, or something was right. He could not tell which. The certainty that had carried him through 4 months of hell had crumbled, leaving only questions and the terrible freedom that came with doubt. He thought about Hal's withdrawing to the railway station. He thought about the 6,000 men who had already surrendered to the Soviets, preferring the uncertain mercy of captivity to the certain death of continued resistance. He thought about General Paulus, locked in his headquarters bunker, paralyzed by conflicting orders from Berlin and the reality of a situation that could not be salvaged by obedience or courage. And he thought about the Soviet sniper across the street who had looked at him and chosen not to kill. The day passed in silence. No orders came. No relief arrived. The soldier ate nothing because there was nothing to eat. He drank melted snow from his canteen and watched the ruins and tried to understand what he was becoming. By evening, he had made a decision. It was not a decision born of ideology or loyalty or even desperation. It was simpler than that. It was the decision of a man who wanted to see another sunrise and had finally accepted that staying meant he would not. When full darkness returned, he gathered his rifle, his ammunition, and the few possessions he still carried. A photograph of his family, creased and faded. A letter from his mother, dated October 19th, 42, the last one to reach him before the encirclement. A pocket watch that had stopped working in November. He left everything else. The greatcoat, too heavy and too recognizable. The helmet, with its German insignia. The uniform jacket, marked with the eagle and swastika. He stripped down to his shirt and trousers, gray and anonymous, and covered himself with a tattered blanket he had taken from a dead Soviet soldier weeks before. Then he climbed down from his position, moving through the factory with the caution of a man who knew every sound could be his last. The ground floor was silent. The bodies remained where they had fallen. Outside, the street stretched before him, an expanse of snow and shadow illuminated by the pale glow of a half-moon breaking through the clouds. He began to walk, not toward the railway station, not toward the German lines. He walked toward the building where the Soviet sniper had been, toward the enemy, toward the men he had been trying to kill for 4 months. His hands were raised above his head, empty and visible. His rifle hung from his shoulder, barrel pointed at the ground. Every step felt like a betrayal. Every breath felt like treason. But he kept walking. And with each step, the weight of what he was leaving behind grew lighter until it felt like nothing at all. The distance was 80 meters. It might as well have been 80 kilometers. The open ground between the factory and the Soviet-held building was a killing field, a stretch of snow marked by dark stains where blood had frozen into the ice. The bodies of the 2 men from his company still lay there, half buried in snow that had fallen since their deaths. Their faces were turned skyward, eyes open and unseeing, mouths frozen in expressions of surprise or pain or simple exhaustion. He walked slowly, deliberately. His raised hands caught the moonlight. Anyone watching would see him. Anyone with a rifle and a moment of hesitation could end his life before he covered half the distance. He accepted this. Death had been a certainty for weeks. The only difference now was that he was walking toward it rather than waiting for it to find him. Halfway across the street, a voice cut through the silence. Russian, sharp and commanding. He stopped. His heart hammered in his chest, a violent percussion that seemed loud enough to wake the dead around him. The voice called again. He did not understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Do not move. Do not reach for your weapon. Do not give us a reason. Figures emerged from the building ahead. 3 men, moving with the careful coordination of soldiers who had survived long enough to learn caution. They wore the padded jackets and fur hats of the Red Army, their rifles trained on him with steady hands. Behind them, more shapes appeared in the shadows. 5 men, 7, 10. They had been waiting. They had seen him leave the factory. They had watched his approach and prepared to receive him or kill him depending on what he did next. One of the soldiers shouted something. The soldier recognized it as an order to kneel. He lowered himself slowly onto the frozen ground, his hands still raised, his rifle sliding from his shoulder into the snow beside him. The cold bit through his trousers immediately, but he did not move. He knelt and waited and tried to control the shaking that had seized his entire body. The Soviet soldiers approached. One of them kicked his rifle away, sending it skittering across the ice. Another grabbed his arms and pulled them behind his back, binding his wrists with rope that cut into his skin. They searched him roughly, efficiently, removing the photograph, the letter, the broken watch. They took his ammunition pouch, his canteen, even the torn cloth wrapped around his hands. They left him with nothing but his clothes and the knowledge that he was now completely at their mercy. They pulled him to his feet and pushed him forward, toward the building. He stumbled, his legs weak from cold and fear and the sudden release of tension that had been building for hours. One of the soldiers caught him, steadying him with a hand that was neither gentle nor cruel, just functional. They entered the building through a gap in the wall where a doorway had once stood. Inside, the temperature was barely warmer, but the absence of wind made it feel like shelter. The ground floor was crowded with Soviet soldiers, perhaps 30 men huddled around small fires built from broken furniture and scraps of wood. They looked up as he was brought in, their faces hard and expressionless. Some were young, younger than him. Others were older, veterans marked by scars and missing fingers, and the particular weariness that came from months of fighting in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. They pushed him through the crowd and down a stairwell into a basement that had been reinforced with sandbags and timber beams. Oil lamps flickered in alcoves carved into the walls, casting shadows that moved and shifted like living things. At the far end of the basement, behind a makeshift table constructed from ammunition crates, sat a Soviet officer. He was older than the others, perhaps 40, with gray threading through his dark hair and deep lines etched into his face. He wore the uniform of a lieutenant, though the insignia was faded and the fabric patched in multiple places. He studied the soldier with eyes that revealed nothing, neither hostility nor sympathy, just assessment. The cold calculation of a man deciding whether the thing brought before him had value or should be discarded. The officer spoke in Russian. One of the soldiers who had captured him stepped forward and translated into rough but understandable German. Your name, your rank, your unit, the soldier answered. He gave them everything. There was no point in resistance. They would extract the information eventually, and cooperation might be the only currency he had left to purchase his survival. He told them he had been a rifleman in the 71st Infantry Division. He told them about the withdrawal orders, about the shrinking perimeter, about the starvation and cold, and the complete collapse of morale. He told them things they already knew, because Soviet intelligence had been interrogating German prisoners for months, and the picture was always the same. The Sixth Army was dying. Every man still fighting knew it. Every man still alive was simply waiting for permission to stop. The officer listened without interruption. When the soldier finished, the officer leaned back in his chair and was silent for a long moment. Then he asked a single question, translated by the soldier standing beside him. "Why did you come here?" The soldier had expected many questions. This was the one he had no answer for. Or rather, he had too many answers, and none of them seemed adequate. "Because I wanted to live. Because I no longer believed in the cause. Because I saw a Soviet sniper who did not kill me, and it broke something inside that I did not know could break." He said none of these things. Instead, he said the only thing that felt true, because there was nothing left to stay for. The officer nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he had been waiting for. He spoke again, and the translator relayed his words. "You will be interrogated further. You will provide details about German positions, supply routes, command structure. If you cooperate, you will be sent to a prisoner camp. If you resist, you will be shot. Do you understand?" The soldier understood. He nodded. The officer dismissed him with a wave of his hand, and the soldiers pulled him back to his feet and led him to a corner of the basement where other prisoners sat under guard. There were 5 of them, all German, all wearing the same expression of exhausted relief mixed with shame. They did not speak to him. He did not speak to them. They simply sat together in silence, listening to the sounds of war continuing above them, knowing they were no longer part of it. Over the next 3 days, he was interrogated 7 times. Different officers asked the same questions in different ways, probing for inconsistencies or useful intelligence. He told them everything he knew: the location of machine gun nests, the positions of artillery batteries, the routes used by German patrols, the names of officers and the condition of the men under their command. Some of what he provided was valuable. Most of it was already outdated, rendered irrelevant by the speed with which the German perimeter was collapsing. But there was one piece of information that made them pay attention. He told them about the factory, about the layout of its interior, about the sight lines and firing positions, and the network of basements that connected to adjoining buildings. He had spent 4 months in that sector. He knew every brick, every shadow, every place where a man could hide or a squad could stage an ambush. And the Soviets were planning to attack that exact area within 48 hours. On the morning of the 9th of January, a Soviet captain came to the basement and pulled him aside. The captain was young, perhaps 25, with the nervous energy of a man who had been promoted too quickly and carried the weight of command like an ill-fitting coat. He spoke through a translator, his words clipped and urgent. "You will guide us through the factory, through the buildings you know. You will show us where the Germans are, where they hide, where they are weak." It was not a request. The soldier nodded. What choice did he have? Refuse, and he would be shot. Comply, and he might survive another day. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. They gave him a Soviet uniform jacket to wear over his own clothes, too large and smelling of sweat and gunpowder. They gave him no weapon. He would walk ahead of them, exposed and vulnerable, a human shield as much as a guide. If German soldiers saw him, they would shoot. If he tried to warn them, the Soviets would shoot. He was caught between 2 armies belonging to neither, trusted by none. The assault began at dawn. 30 men from the Soviet 62nd Army, led by the young captain, with the German soldier at the front. They moved through the ruins with practiced silence, using the cover of rubble and smoke to mask their approach. The soldier led them along routes he had traveled 100 times, through basements and shattered hallways, and across courtyards where the snow was stained black with ash. They reached the factory without encountering resistance. The building was empty. The German withdrawal had been completed during the night. The remaining troops pulled back to consolidate around the railway station, just as Hals had said. The Soviet soldiers searched the rooms methodically, finding abandoned equipment, empty ammunition boxes, and the bodies of men too wounded or sick to be moved. They found no living Germans. The soldier felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that he would not have to watch his former comrades die. Disappointment that his usefulness had just diminished significantly. But the captain was not finished. He pointed to the north, toward a cluster of buildings that formed the next defensive line. The soldier knew those buildings too. He had fought in them, bled in them, watched friends die in them. He nodded and began walking. Over the next 6 days, he guided Soviet units through 12 separate engagements. Some were quick and brutal, ending in minutes with a handful of dead on each side. Others dragged on for hours, room to room fighting where every doorway was contested and every meter of ground cost lives. He did not carry a weapon. He simply walked ahead, pointing out positions, identifying weak points, speaking in a low voice to the translator who relayed his words to the officers. He watched Germans die, men he had never met, but who could have been his brothers or his friends or himself in a different timeline. He watched them fight with the desperation of the cornered and the doomed, expending their final strength in defense of ruins that had no strategic value and a cause that had already abandoned them. He watched them surrender when their ammunition ran out, raising their hands in the same gesture he had made a week before, their faces carrying the same mixture of shame and relief. And he felt nothing. The part of him that could feel guilt or sorrow or regret had frozen somewhere in the ruins of Stalingrad, buried under snow and death and the simple necessity of survival. He was a mechanism now, a tool used by the Soviets to achieve their objectives. He performed his function and did not question it, because questioning required a sense of self that he no longer possessed. On the 15th of January, the German perimeter around the railway station collapsed. Thousands of soldiers surrendered en masse, too weak to fight, too broken to care. General Paulus, isolated in his bunker, sent increasingly desperate messages to Berlin requesting permission to capitulate. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army was ordered to fight to annihilation, but annihilation was already complete. The army had ceased to exist as a functional fighting force. What remained were scattered pockets of starving, freezing men who could no longer remember why they were fighting. The soldier's usefulness ended with the German collapse. There were no more positions to identify, no more routes to guide. The battle had moved beyond him. On the 16th of January, he was transferred to a prisoner collection point near the Volga River, a warehouse where hundreds of German captives sat in rows, guarded by Soviet soldiers who looked almost as exhausted as their prisoners. He sat among them, anonymous and silent. Some of the prisoners talked, sharing stories of their capture or speculating about what would happen next. Others simply stared into nothing, their minds retreating to places where the war could not follow. The soldier did neither. He sat and breathed and felt the slow return of something that might have been emotion, though he could not name it or understand its source. Days passed, weeks. The prisoners were processed, documented, and prepared for transport to camps deep in the Soviet interior. Some would survive the journey, many would not. The soldier did not think about survival anymore. Survival had become something that happened to him rather than something he pursued. He was passive, inert, waiting for whatever came next. On the 31st of January, 1943, General Friedrich Paulus surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 300,000 German soldiers who had been encircled, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The rest died in the ruins or in captivity, their bodies lost to mass graves and frozen rivers and the vast emptiness of the Russian steppe. The soldier was among those who survived the initial transport. He was sent to a camp near Voronezh, then to another near Moscow, then to a third whose name he never learned. Years passed. The war ended. Germany was divided, occupied, transformed into something unrecognizable. When prisoners finally began to be repatriated in the late 1940s and early 50s, he was among them, though by then he was no longer young and no longer whole. He returned to Bavaria in the spring of 1950. His mother had died during the war. His brother had survived, working the farm with a stoicism born of necessity. They did not speak of what had happened. There was no language adequate to the experience, no words that could bridge the distance between those who had been there and those who had not. The soldier never spoke of Stalingrad, never mentioned the factory or the Soviet sniper or the choice he had made on that frozen January night. The shame of defection was a burden he carried in silence, a weight that grew heavier with each passing year as Germany rebuilt, and the war became memory and memory became myth. Those who had fought were honored. Those who had survived captivity were pitied. Those who had switched sides were forgotten, their names absent from the records, their stories buried beneath the narrative of heroism and sacrifice that the new Germany chose to tell itself. He lived quietly. He worked odd jobs, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments or answer questions. He avoided veterans' gatherings and memorial services. He did not speak of duty or honor or the righteousness of the cause. Those words had lost their meaning in the ruins of Stalingrad, and he had never found replacements. In 1968, he died of pneumonia, his lungs damaged by the Russian winter and never fully healed. He was 53 years old. He left no family, no letters, no testament. The local newspaper ran a brief obituary, identifying him only as a veteran of the Eastern Front. No one attended his funeral except the priest who administered the last rites and the gravedigger who covered his casket with Bavarian soil. His name remains unknown. The Soviet archives that document his defection and his role as a guide were declassified decades after his death, but they contain no identifying information beyond his rank and division. He is a footnote in the history of Stalingrad, a single line in reports that describe thousands of defections, surrenders, and deaths. One man among millions who made a choice in a moment of desperation and lived with the consequences for the rest of his life. But in that moment, on that frozen January night, when he walked across 80 meters of snow with his hands raised and his rifle on his shoulder, he was something more than a footnote. He was a man who had reached the limits of endurance and found that survival required the abandonment of everything he had been taught to value. Loyalty, duty, honor, the bonds that tied him to his nation and his comrades and the cause for which he had been willing to die. He traded those things for life. Whether that trade was worth making, he never decided. Some nights in the years that followed, he dreamed of the factory and the Soviet sniper who had looked at him and chosen not to fire. In those dreams, he understood that they had recognized something in each other, some shared knowledge that transcended nationality and ideology. They had both seen enough of death to know that one more killing would change nothing, would mean nothing, would simply add another body to a city already drowning in corpses. And so they had both lowered their rifles, and one of them had walked away, and the other had watched him go. The snow in Stalingrad that winter was stained red for months. The Volga River carried bodies downstream until spring, when the ice melted and the current swept away the evidence of what had occurred. The city was rebuilt, renamed, transformed into a symbol of Soviet resistance and German defeat. Monuments were erected, museums were opened. The story of Stalingrad became legend, simplified and sanitized until it bore little resemblance to the reality lived by those who had been there. But the truth remained, buried in archives and memories, and the silence of men who had seen things they could never speak of. The truth that war reduces men to their most basic selves, stripping away pretense and ideology until only the animal remains. The animal that wants to live. The animal that will do whatever it takes to see another sunrise. The German soldier who switched sides in the middle of battle was that animal. He was every soldier who has ever stood at the edge of his endurance and looked into the abyss and made a choice that could not be unmade. He was the cost of war that no one speaks of, the human price paid in shame and guilt, and the slow erosion of everything that makes a man believe his life has meaning. When dawn rose over the ruins of Stalingrad in the days after his defection, his footprints in the snow were already covered by fresh fall. The evidence of his crossing erased. The proof of his choice buried beneath white silence. And in that erasure, in that burial, there was a kind of mercy, not absolution, not forgiveness, just the cold comfort of being forgotten. This was Untold Dawn. If history fascinates you, subscribe and join us as we uncover more forgotten truths.